My mother-in-law locked my 4-year-old in the basement for 3 hours because he spilled juice on her carpet. When I came home he was shaking and couldn't speak. She laughed and said, "He needs discipline." I said nothing. I drove straight to the hospital. What the doctor documented that night became the first page of a case file she never saw coming. She was sitting at the kitchen table drinking tea when I found my son locked in the basement. Like it was a normal Tuesday. I came up those stairs carrying my baby, his body shaking, his fingers gripping my shirt so tight I thought he'd tear the fabric, and she looked at me and laughed. Actually laughed. "Oh, relax," she said. "He needs to learn that actions have consequences. It was only apple juice. He'll survive." I looked at that woman and I felt something cold settle inside my chest. Not anger. Something quieter. Something she should have been afraid of. My name is Lauren Covington. I am 32 years old. And 3 hours earlier, I had left my 4-year-old son Elijah with his grandmother, my mother-in-law Diane, while I drove to Target to buy new school shoes for my oldest. That was the only reason I was gone. 20 minutes there, 20 minutes back, 10 minutes in the store. Diane had volunteered to watch him. She had called me that morning and said, "You look tired, Lauren. Let me help." I should have known then. Diane never helps without wanting something. I was tired. I was so tired. Elijah's lips were blue when I carried him out of that basement. Not purple. Blue. His whole body had that trembly shake you see in dogs who have been left out in a storm. He wasn't crying. That was what got me. He wasn't crying. He was making a sound like a tea kettle that had run out of water. This thin, whistling breath that came out of him in little bursts. I held him against my chest and I could feel his heart going too fast like a hummingbird trapped in a jar. He weighed nothing. He always felt so light to me, but that night he felt like he was disappearing in my arms. Before I tell you what happened next, if you have ever had someone do something to your child and then laugh about it like you were the one being dramatic, hit that like button right now. I need to know I am not alone in this. Subscribe if you are new. Drop your city in the comments. And stay with me because what Diane did next was 10 times worse than locking a 4-year-old in a dark basement. I didn't say anything to her at the kitchen table. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just turned around with Elijah in my arms and walked out the front door of her house on Maple Street in Clifton, New Jersey. It was 3:47 in the afternoon. I remember the time because the clock on her microwave was blinking. She never fixed it after the power outage last winter, and I saw the numbers as I passed through the kitchen. 3:47. Elijah had been down there since 12:30. She told me that later like it was a detail she wanted credit for remembering. "He went down at 12:30, she said. "I checked on him at 1 o'clock. He was fine. A 4-year-old alone in a basement. Fine." The drive to St. Mary's Hospital took 11 minutes. I drove exactly the speed limit because I could not afford to get pulled over. That was the cold thing inside me working already. Calculating, measuring, deciding what I could risk and what I could not. Elijah stayed curled in the passenger seat with his seatbelt across him, his little hands still gripping the collar of my shirt even though I had buckled him in. He wouldn't look at me. He wouldn't look at anything. His eyes were open but they weren't seeing. I know what shock looks like. I saw it once when I was 23 and a car hit my father's dog right in front of me. The same empty stare. The same body that forgot how to be a body. At the emergency room I carried him inside and I said 4 words to the woman at the intake desk. My mother-in-law locked him. That was all I said. The woman looked at Elijah's face, at his lips that were still too pale, at the way his fingers were locked into a claw shape around my sleeve, and she didn't ask any more questions. She took us back immediately. That should have told me something right there. That a stranger in an emergency room took one look at my son and knew without me explaining that something had been done to him. The doctor came in after about 7 minutes. Her name was Dr. Vasquez. She was maybe 50 with gray in her hair and the kind of face that had seen things and decided not to flinch anymore. She asked me what happened and I told her. Diane locked Elijah in the basement because he spilled apple juice on her beige carpet. Beige. The carpet was beige. She had bought it 3 months ago from a catalog and she had made everyone take their shoes off at the door ever since. She had made my husband Mark take his shoes off. Mark is 41 years old. His mother made him take his shoes off in her house like he was 10. Dr. Vasquez examined Elijah for a long time. He checked his pupils, his pulse, his breathing. She asked him questions he couldn't answer. She asked me if he had a history of seizures. I said no. She asked if he had ever been left alone before. I said not like this. Then she said something that made my stomach drop through the floor. She said, I'm going to document everything I find tonight. Every mark, every measurement, every vital sign. This will become part of his medical record permanently. Do you understand what that means? I understood. She was building a case file. And Diane had no idea it was happening. That was Tuesday. By Friday, I would understand why Mark had been so calm when I called him from the hospital. But I did not know that yet. Dr. Vasquez found bruising on Elijah's left wrist. Not new bruising, older, yellowed, the kind that was already healing. He asked me where it came from. I opened my mouth to say I didn't know, and then I closed it because I did know. Diane had grabbed his arm 2 weeks ago at a family barbecue when he tried to run toward the street. She had grabbed him hard enough that he cried. I had seen it. Mark had seen it. Mark's father, Richard, had seen it. And none of us had said anything because Diane had laughed and said, he's fast, that one. Gotta have quick hands with a boy like that. Quick hands. That was what she called it. I called Mark from the hospital waiting room while Elijah slept on a gurney. Mark answered on the second ring and I told him what his mother had done. There was a pause. A long one. Then he said, she wouldn't lock him in the basement, Lauren. You must have misunderstood. I stood in that waiting room with the fluorescent lights buzzing above me and I felt the cold thing in my chest get colder. She admitted it, I said. She told me she did it. She laughed. Another pause. I'll talk to her, he said. I'm sure there's an explanation. He did not ask if Elijah was okay. He did not ask what hospital we were at. He said he would talk to her. As if this was a scheduling conflict. As if his mother had borrowed something without asking. I drove home at 9 o'clock that night with Elijah asleep in the back seat. He had finally stopped shaking around 7:30, when the nurses brought him a warm blanket and apple slices and he ate 3 of them before his body gave up and he fell asleep sitting up. I watched him in the rearview mirror the whole way home. The streetlights passed over his face in strips of yellow and dark, and I counted his breaths. 12 per minute. That was what the monitor had shown. 12 breaths per minute, and his oxygen had been 94% when they checked him at intake. 94. Dr. Vasquez had said that was low for a child his age. She had said it in a voice that told me she was writing it down. Mark was on the couch when I got home. He had the TV on, some baseball game, the volume low, and a beer on the coffee table. He looked up when I came in and he said, "How's Eli?" Not, "Where have you been?" or, "Why didn't you call me back?" or, "I was worried." How's Eli? Like he had been waiting for an update on a minor situation. I put Elijah in his bed and I came back to the living room and I sat down across from my husband of 9 years and I said, "Your mother locked our 4-year-old son in her basement for over 3 hours because he spilled juice. He was in the dark. He was alone. He was shaking when I found him. And you asked me if I misunderstood." Mark set his beer down and he did something I had seen him do 100 times before. He rubbed the back of his neck and he looked at the floor and he said, "You know how Mom is." I did know how Diane was. I had known for 11 years, ever since Mark brought me to that same house on Maple Street for Thanksgiving, and Diane had looked at my outfit, a gray sweater dress and boots, and said, "Oh, that's a choice." I knew how she was when she called my mother, that woman, because my mother had divorced my father and Diane considered divorce a moral failure. I knew how she was when she bought Elijah a winter coat 2 sizes too small and said, "He'll grow into it," when really she had just wanted to be the one who bought the coat. I knew how she was. But knowing how someone is and watching them do something to your child are 2 different countries, and I had just crossed the border. 3 things happened in the next 48 hours that I still cannot put in the right order in my head. The first was that Diane called me. Not to apologize. To tell me that I had overreacted and that she hoped I wasn't planning to make this into a whole thing. Her exact words. "I hope you aren't planning to make this into a whole thing, Lauren. The boy is fine. Children need discipline. You're too soft on him and everyone sees it." I held the phone away from my ear and I looked at it like it was a spider I had found on my pillow. Then I hung up. I did not say goodbye. I just pressed the red button and I sat there in my kitchen. The same kitchen where I had made Elijah's breakfast that morning. The same kitchen where I had poured his apple juice into the blue cup he likes. The same kitchen where I had kissed Mark goodbye before he left for work. And I realized that Diane had just done me a favor. She had put it in writing. Not in writing but recorded. My phone had a recording feature. I had never used it before. I used it that night. The second thing was that Mark's sister, my sister-in-law Andrea, called me from Phoenix. Andrea and I had never been close. She was Diane's daughter through and through. Same sharp chin, same way of tilting her head when she was about to say something cruel disguised as honesty. But Andrea said something that night that I have thought about every day since. She said, "She did the same thing to me when I was 7. She locked me in the basement because I left a popsicle on the couch and it melted into the fabric. I was down there for 4 hours. I wet my pants because I was too scared to go upstairs." Andrea was crying. I had never heard Andrea cry. Not at her wedding, not when her cat died, not when she told me about her miscarriage. But she was crying on the phone that night and her voice sounded small, like she was 7 again, like she was still in that basement. "I never told anyone," she said. "I thought no one would believe me." The third thing was that I went back to Diane's house on Thursday morning while she was at her bridge club. Mark had given me the key to her back door years ago. "In case of emergencies," he had said. I had never used it. I used it that morning. I walked into Diane's basement with my phone's camera and I took 47 photographs. The light bulb that had burned out. Diane had mentioned it at dinner 2 weeks ago, said she needed to call an electrician, said it wasn't urgent because she never went down there anyway. The locked door. A hook and eye latch on the outside, the kind you install on a garden shed, not on a room where a child could be trapped. The concrete floor where Elijah had sat for 3 hours. The water heater that hummed and clicked. The single window, too high to reach, covered in cobwebs. I took a picture of everything. Then I drove to the Clifton Police Department and I filed a report. The officer who took my statement was a woman named Detective Mullins. She was maybe 40, with short hair and glasses and the kind of posture that said she had been yelled at by a lot of men and had not flinched once. She listened to everything I said. She wrote things down. She asked me if I had evidence and I showed her the photographs. I showed her the recording of Diane's phone call. I gave her Dr. Vasquez's name and the hospital's information. And then Detective Mullins looked at me and said, "Mrs. Covington, do you understand that what you're describing is felony unlawful imprisonment in the 2nd degree? Your mother-in-law could be looking at 3 to 5 years." I understood. What I did not understand yet was that Mark would not believe me when I told him I had filed a report. I told him that night. We were in bed. The lights were off. Elijah was asleep in his room down the hall. And I turned to Mark in the dark and I said, "I filed a police report against your mother today." The silence that followed lasted so long I thought he had fallen asleep. Then he sat up. He turned on the lamp. He looked at me like he had never seen me before. "You did what?" he said. Not a question. An accusation. "You went to the police? Against my mother?" "My mother." He said it 3 times like repeating it would make it less real. I sat up too. I looked at him. And I said, "She locked our son in a basement, Mark." She laughed about it. "And you told me I misunderstood." He got out of bed. He walked to the window. He stood there with his back to me and he said, "You should have talked to me first." I said, "I did talk to you. You said she wouldn't do it." He turned around and his face was red in a way I had never seen. "She's my mother, Lauren. She raised me. She raised Andrea. She's not a criminal." I got out of bed. I walked to the closet. I pulled out the suitcase I had not used since our trip to Ocean City 2 summers ago. Mark watched me. He did not stop me. He did not ask me where I was going. He said, "If you do this, if you go after my mother, you are going after my whole family." I zipped the suitcase and I looked at him and I said, "No, Mark. Your family already went after my son. I'm just finishing it." I have to pause here for 1 second. Because what I am about to tell you, the part that comes next, is the part that makes people say, "No way." I need you to hit that like button if you are still with me. And if you have ever been in a situation where someone underestimated you so badly that they handed you exactly what you needed to destroy them, right? They had no idea in the comments. Stay with me. This is where everything flips. I did not leave that night. I should have. But I did not leave because Elijah was asleep and I could not carry him in the suitcase and the diaper bag and the bag of his toys all at once. And I was so tired that my bones felt like they were made of wet sand. So I slept in Elijah's room. I lay down on the floor next to his bed with a pillow from the hall closet and a blanket from the linen shelf, and I listened to him breathe. 12 breaths per minute. I counted them until I fell asleep. In the morning Mark was gone. His truck was not in the driveway. His toothbrush was still in the bathroom, I checked. But his work boots were missing and so was his favorite jacket. I called his phone. It went straight to voicemail. I texted him. No response. I called his office. His secretary said he had called in sick. I stood in my kitchen. The same kitchen where I had poured Elijah's apple juice 3 days ago. The same kitchen where Diane had sat drinking tea. And I understood that Mark had gone to his mother's house. He had chosen. Not with words. With his truck keys. At 9:30 that morning I got a call from Detective Mullins. She said Diane had come to the station with a lawyer. A lawyer. Diane had hired a lawyer before she had apologized, before she had asked if Elijah was okay, before she had done anything that a grandmother who made a mistake would do. She had hired a lawyer named Gerald Parnell, who according to his website had been practicing family law in Passaic County for 31 years. Diane had not panicked. Diane had not cried. Diane had gone on the offensive. And that was when I knew, really knew, that this woman was not confused, not old-fashioned, not strict. She was calculated. She had been calculated for a long time. And I was going to have to be more calculated than her. Andrea flew in from Phoenix that afternoon. She did not tell Diane she was coming. She showed up at my door with a duffel bag and a box of donuts and she said, "I'm staying until this is over." I let her in. I made coffee. We sat at my kitchen table. The same table where I had sat 1,000 times, the same table where Mark and I had eaten dinner every night for 9 years. And Andrea told me things about Diane that made my coffee go cold. She told me about the time Diane had locked Mark in the garage when he was 10 because he had tracked mud onto her new carpet. Mark had been in there for 6 hours. He had broken a window to get out. Diane had made him pay for the window with his allowance. She had deducted it over 8 months. Andrea told me about the time Diane had called Child Protective Services on a neighbor because the neighbor's daughter had scuffed Diane's front step with her bicycle. The case had been unfounded, but the neighbor had moved away 3 months later. Andrea told me about the time Diane had forged Richard's signature on a refinancing document for the house on Maple Street. Richard had found out 2 years later. He had not left her. He had not even yelled. He had just started sleeping in the guest room and never stopped. I asked Andrea why she was telling me all of this now. She looked at me with Diane's sharp chin and Diane's tilted head and she said, "Because she's been getting away with it for 40 years. And I think you might be the one who finally makes her stop." That was the moment I realized I was not just fighting for Elijah. I was fighting for every person Diane had ever locked in a basement, every neighbor she had ever driven away, every signature she had ever forged, every silence she had ever demanded. I was fighting for Andrea at 7 years old, wetting her pants in the dark. I was fighting for Mark at 10 years old, breaking a window with his bare hand. I was fighting for Richard, sleeping alone in his own house for 18 years. And Diane had no idea that the woman she had dismissed as too soft was about to become the hardest thing she had ever faced. I called a lawyer that afternoon. Not Gerald Parnell. Someone else. Someone my friend Jenna from work had used when her ex-husband tried to take the kids. Her name was Carolyn Reese and she had an office above a bakery on Lexington Avenue in Clifton. I went to see her at 4 o'clock. I brought the photographs. I brought the recording. I brought the hospital discharge papers with Dr. Vasquez's notes. I brought a list of every date I could remember when Diane had done something that made my stomach turn. Carolyn read everything. She looked at me over her glasses and she said, "You understand that if you pursue this, your marriage is over. Mark will not forgive you." I said, "Mark left this morning. He went to her house. He didn't even say goodbye to Elijah." Carolyn nodded. She wrote something down. Then she said, "Here's what we're going to do." The next 7 days were the longest of my life. I went to work every day. I am an office manager at a dental practice on Bloomfield Avenue. And I smiled at patients and I filed insurance claims and I pretended that my life was not crumbling. Andrea stayed at my house. He watched Elijah while I was at work. She cooked dinners that I could not eat. She held my hand when I cried in the bathroom with the water running so Elijah would not hear. And every night after Elijah was asleep, Andrea and I sat at the kitchen table and we planned. We wrote down everything we remembered. Every incident. Every date. Every witness. We called people, neighbors, cousins, old friends of Richard's, and we asked them if they had ever seen Diane do something that did not seem right. Most of them said no. Some of them said maybe. 3 of them said yes. One of them was Richard. He called me on Tuesday night. I had not spoken to my father-in-law in months. Not since the birthday dinner where Diane had made a comment about my weight and Richard had looked at his plate and said nothing. But he called me that night and his voice was different. Smaller. "I know what she did to the boy," he said. "Andrea told me." There was a long pause. I could hear him breathing. I should have stopped her years ago. The first time she locked Andrea in that basement, I should have stopped her. But I didn't. I told myself it was discipline. I told myself she meant well. He started to cry. Richard, who I had never seen cry, who I had never even seen look sad, started to cry on the phone. "She doesn't mean well," he said. "She never meant well. He dislikes control. And I gave it to her for 40 years. I did not know what to say. So I said nothing. And then Richard said the words that changed everything. "I'll testify. If you need me to, I'll tell them everything." On Thursday morning, Detective Mullins called me again. She said the prosecutor's office had reviewed the evidence and they were moving forward with charges. Unlawful imprisonment. Child endangerment. They were going to arrest Diane. She said it would probably happen that afternoon. I hung up the phone and I sat on my couch and I stared at the wall. Andrea was in the kitchen. Elijah was in his room playing with his toy trucks. I could hear him making engine sounds, vroom vroom, low and rumbly, and I thought about how 3 weeks ago those sounds had been background noise. Now they were the only thing keeping me from falling apart. Diane was arrested at 3:15 that afternoon. I know the time because Andrea texted me. "It's done." 3 words. I was at work. I was standing at the front desk of the dental practice, looking at a schedule full of patients I would never remember, and I read those 3 words and I felt the cold thing in my chest crack open. Not melt. Like ice breaking up on a river in spring. I excused myself to the bathroom and I sat on the closed toilet lid and I put my head in my hands and I cried. Not because I was sad. Because I was tired. Because I had been holding something together for 11 days and it had finally become too heavy. Mark showed up at the house that night at 9:30. He was drunk. I could smell it on him before he even opened his mouth. He stood in my doorway, our doorway, still technically his doorway, and he said, "I hope you're happy. My mother is in jail. My father won't speak to me. Andrea won't return my calls. You destroyed my family." I stepped back and I let him in because I did not want the neighbors to hear. But I did not let him pass the living room. I stood between him and the hallway that led to Elijah's room and I said, "I didn't destroy your family, Mark. Your mother did that. I just refused to pretend she didn't." He tried to push past me. Not hard, just a hand on my shoulder, a nudge. But I had been waiting for that hand. I had been waiting for it since the night he asked me if I had misunderstood. I stepped sideways and I blocked him and I said, "If you touch me again, I will call the police. And I will show them the recording of your mother laughing about locking our son in the basement. And then I will show them the photographs of the bruise on his wrist. And then I will show them the hospital report that says his oxygen was 94% when we arrived. Do you understand me?" Mark looked at me. His eyes were red and wet and confused. He had never seen me like this. No one had. Because I had never been like this. Diane had made me like this. And I was not sorry. He left. He got back in his truck and he drove away and I watched his taillights disappear down the street and I thought about the first time I met Mark at a bar in Montclair when I was 21 and he was 30. I had thought he was handsome. I had thought he was steady. I had not known that steady meant passive. I had not known that handsome meant his mother's cheekbones. I closed the door. I locked it. I went to Elijah's room and I lay down on the floor next to his bed and I listened to him breathe. The case went to grand jury 3 weeks later. Diane was indicted on 2 counts. Her lawyer, Gerald Parnell, tried to get it dismissed. He argued that Diane had been exercising reasonable discipline and that the basement was not unsafe. The prosecutor brought in Dr. Vasquez, who testified that a 4-year-old left alone in a dark basement for 3 hours could suffer psychological harm. She cited studies. She cited her own 23 years of pediatric experience. She cited the fact that Elijah had shown signs of acute stress response, including tachycardia, tachypnea, and temporary mutism. That was the word she used. Mutism. My son had stopped speaking because of what Diane had done to him. He had started speaking again on the 4th day, but he had not said the word grandma since. He would not say it now. He would not even look at a woman with gray hair. Richard testified. He sat in the witness box with his hands folded on his lap and he told the grand jury about the time Diane had locked Andrea in the basement in 1994. He told them about the garage door he had had to replace after Mark broke the window. He told them about the refinancing document he had never signed. And then he said, "I am testifying against my own wife because I should have done it 30 years ago." The grand jury indicted her in 45 minutes. That was the first page of a case file Diane never saw coming. But it was not the last. If you made it all the way to the end, you are my people. Hit the like button, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, what is the one thing you wish you had done sooner? Not the big thing, the small thing. The phone call you should have made. The door you should have locked. The word you should have said. Write it down. I read every single one. There is another story waiting for you in the description, and I think you are ready for it. Take care of yourself. I mean that. The divorce was final 6 months later. Mark did not fight me for custody. He did not fight me for the house. He did not fight me for anything. He signed the papers and he moved into an apartment on the other side of Clifton and he saw Elijah every other weekend for a while, and then every third weekend and then not at all. I do not know where he is now. I do not look for him. Diane took a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to child endangerment in exchange for the unlawful imprisonment charge being dropped. She got 18 months of probation, a fine, and mandatory anger management counseling. She also got something that was not in the court order. A permanent record. A case file with her name on it. A piece of paper that said, in the state of New Jersey's official language, that Diane Covington had locked her 4-year-old grandson in a basement because he spilled apple juice. That paper exists. I have a copy in a fireproof safe in my closet. I will keep it until Elijah is old enough to decide what he wants to do with it. Andrea moved back to Phoenix, but she calls me every Sunday. She sends Elijah birthday presents. She sends me texts that say, "You've got this," on days when I do not think I do. Richard divorced Diane 3 months after the plea deal. He lives in a small apartment in Paterson now. He comes over every other Friday and plays trucks with Elijah on the living room floor. He does not talk about Diane. Neither do I. Last week Elijah asked me a question. We were sitting on the front porch. It was evening, the kind of evening where the light turns everything gold and the air smells like someone's barbecue. Elijah was eating an apple slice. He still loves apple slices, and he looked up at me and said, "Mama, why did Grandma put me in the dark?" I had been waiting for this question for 9 months. I had practiced the answer in my head 100 times. But when he asked it, I did not say any of the things I had practiced. I put my hand on his hair and I said, "Because she made a bad choice, baby. And choices have consequences." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he went back to his apple slice. And I sat there on my front porch in Clifton, New Jersey, with the gold light on my face and my son's head against my shoulder. And I felt the cold thing that had lived in my chest since that Tuesday afternoon finally leave. Not melt. Not crack. Just leave. Like it had never belonged there in the first place. If this story touched something in you, that cold feeling of realizing someone you trusted was never who you thought, then you know why I couldn't stay quiet. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories from women who stopped staying silent. And comment one word. The name of the person who taught you that you were stronger than you knew. Share this with a woman who needs to hear it. You might be saving someone's son, someone's daughter, someone's life.